The street was quiet, the kind of calm you'd expect on a Saturday morning in suburbia, until her voice split the silence. "You had no right," she screamed, finger jabbing the air like a weapon. Sandra's face was red with fury, her voice rising high enough to stir curtains and draw glances from behind closed doors. Malcolm Reeves stood still, his posture calm, his hands at his sides. He didn't flinch, didn't match her volume. His eyes didn't even waver. "You parked in my driveway," he said evenly. "Again." Neighbors peeked from porches, frozen in half-curious, half-nervous silence. One of them, just barely visible, through the blinds, recorded quietly with their phone. Behind Sandra, the metallic clank of a tow chain snapped into place as her silver SUV began to lift off the ground, tires dangling midair. Her voice faltered. "Let us know where you're watching from," because what she didn't know is about to cost her everything. Malcolm Reeves had never been one to make waves. In his early 40s, he moved with quiet precision, the kind that came from building everything he had with his own hands and mind. A senior tech consultant for a global firm, Malcolm worked remotely most days, his home office tucked neatly behind the spotless white shutters of his single-story house. He'd bought the home 3 years ago, a reward for 2 decades of disciplined saving, late nights, and careful planning. The lawn was always trimmed. The hedges were shaped. The paint never chipped. His pride in the house wasn't about showing off. It was about ownership, legacy, and peace. Across the street lived Sandra Whitlow. Early 50s, always in tank tops and sunglasses, her presence was louder than her car engine, and that was saying something. She'd lived in the neighborhood far longer and made sure everyone knew it. While she never said anything overt, her attitude toward Malcolm often carried the weight of condescension masked in politeness. "Just parking for a minute," she'd say, waving casually as she pulled into his driveway without asking. At first, Malcolm said nothing. Then he tried a gentle reminder, then a written note. But Sandra kept parking there, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for hours. The neighborhood was the kind that smiled tight when you walked by, the kind where block parties were organized without certain people being informed. Malcolm noticed, but he didn't complain. He didn't shout. He trimmed his hedges, waved back, and stayed focused on what he came here to do: live in peace. But his driveway, that clean, measured strip of concrete, meant more than parking space. It was a symbol, a line between what was his and what wasn't. And Sandra crossed it again and again, not because she needed to, but because she believed she could. It started as an inconvenience. Then it became a habit. Now it was a clear act of disregard. Despite Malcolm's polite notes taped neatly to her windshield, calm conversations on the sidewalk, and even doorbell camera footage showing just how often it happened, Sandra kept parking in his driveway like it belonged to her. Each time she'd offer the same dismissive excuse: "It's just for a minute." But that minute stretched into hours more than once, leaving Malcolm with nowhere to park in front of. His own home. The final straw came on a Thursday night. Malcolm had just finished a 14-hour shift troubleshooting a critical server crash for a global client. He pulled onto his street, exhausted and hungry, only to find her SUV sitting in his driveway, again. No sign of her, no note, just entitlement. He sat in the car for a moment, eyes closed, hands gripping the wheel. The groceries in the back seat were already starting to sweat in the summer heat. He called her cell. She answered on the second ring, already annoyed. "What?" "Sandra," he said evenly. I need you to move your car. I just got home. This is the third time this week." There was a pause, then a snort. "You don't need to get so hostile, Malcolm. It's not that deep." And then she hung up. He stared at the phone, jaw tight, but his voice never raised. Instead, a memory flickered. His father, leaning over the hood of an old Ford, wiping grease from his hands. "Son, you don't fight every battle. But when you do, make sure it's one they won't forget." Malcolm nodded to no one, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. Calm, steady. Then he picked up his phone again, this time to call the tow truck. The next morning, the peace of sunrise was shattered by the slam of a screen door and the stomp of bare feet on pavement. Sandra stormed across the street, waving a piece of paper in one hand and rage in the other. "You had my car towed?" she shouted, her voice already drawing shades and blinds open all along the block. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Malcolm stood on his porch, coffee in hand, dressed as if nothing unusual had happened. He didn't respond right away. He took a sip, calm, as ever, letting her words hang in the air. "You're being aggressive," she snapped, jabbing her finger at him like punctuation. "You could have talked to me. But no, you had to be dramatic, overreacting like that." Still, he didn't speak. Neighbors were now peeking from windows. A few stepped out onto porches. A couple walking their dog paused on the sidewalk, unsure whether to keep moving or stay. No one said a word, but everyone was listening. Finally, Malcolm set his coffee cup down on the porch rail and walked to the edge of his lawn. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Sandra," he said, "I did talk to you. I asked you. I wrote you notes. I showed you the footage. You ignored all of it." She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand. Not aggressively, but with quiet finality. "You parked in my driveway. Again and again. Not because you had to, but because you knew I wouldn't make a scene." As if on cue, a rumble echoed down the street. The tow truck that had removed her SUV the night before reappeared, pulling up slowly in front of Malcolm's house. The driver hopped out and walked directly to Sandra, extending a white envelope with practiced indifference. "Invoice," he said. "City certified tow. Car was trespassing." Sandra snatched it from his hand, her mouth twitching. This is ridiculous. But now the neighbors weren't just watching. They were nodding. One even stepped closer and said quietly, "Honestly, you park in his spot all the time." Sandra turned, stunned. She was expecting support. Instead, she found silence. Not one voice defended her. Not one head shook in Malcolm's direction. And still, he never raised his voice. But now the whole block heard him. Not through shouting, but through a boundary finally enforced. Through dignity held firm. Through a silence louder than all her noise. Humiliated and seething, Sandra wasn't done. Later that same day, she filed a police report claiming Malcolm had threatened her during their confrontation. "He stood over me," she told the responding officer, clutching her purse in dramatic disbelief. "He was aggressive. I felt unsafe." Her voice quivered, just enough to sound convincing to someone who didn't know the full story, or the pattern. But Malcolm did know the pattern, and this time, so did the evidence. When the officer arrived at Malcolm's door that evening, clipboard in hand, Malcolm didn't argue. He simply invited the officer inside, walked over to the console by the door, and queued up the saved footage from his security camera. With a few taps, the screen displayed the entire exchange, from Sandra's stomping arrival to the final moment she stormed off, red-faced and shouting. In the video, Malcolm's posture remained neutral, his voice never above conversation level, his hands at his sides. The officer watched in silence. When the clip ended, he blinked, adjusted his stance, and sighed. "That's all I needed," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." No charges were filed, no warning was issued to Malcolm. But Sandra, she received one, a formal citation for filing, a false report, and the ripple didn't stop there. The HOA president, who for years had smiled thinly at Malcolm and ignored his emails about neighborhood rules, now sent Sandra an official letter: unauthorized parking, violation of HOA code, and disorderly conduct toward a resident. Power had quietly shifted. Malcolm hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed, he hadn't even stepped off his porch. But the truth was undeniable now, and it was catching wind. The doorbell. Cam footage found its way online, shared first by a neighbor, then by a community page. It spread quickly, captioned simply, "How to Win Without a Shout." Within days, it racked up thousands of views. Comments flooded in. "This is how you carry dignity. That's grace under fire," and "He gave a master class in restraint." And through it all, Malcolm said nothing, because he didn't need to speak for the truth to echo. The fallout hit Sandra faster than she ever expected. The video, barely 2 minutes long, swept through neighborhood forums, TikTok, and even national news commentary with breathtaking speed. One moment, she was yelling across Malcolm's lawn, and the next, her name and face were being dissected on social feeds and morning talk shows. People weren't just watching. They were angry. Commenters called out her entitlement, her arrogance, the audacity of filing a false police report against a man who had remained calm, composed, and respectful throughout the entire ordeal. There were side-by-side edits, her shouting on one, half of the screen, Malcolm's steady gaze on the other. The contrast was damning. Sandra did what many do under the weight of accountability. She disappeared. Social media accounts gone. Porch lights off. Delivery packages picked up quickly like she didn't want to be seen. And she never parked in Malcolm's driveway again. Not once. The space that had once been treated as hers without permission now remained untouched, like a silent acknowledgement of a boundary she'd been forced to respect. Still, the neighborhood could feel the tension. Her silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. But Malcolm didn't need her apology. He didn't need her smile or her approval. What he had needed, respect, was finally his. And it hadn't come through confrontation. It had come through patience, principle, and the power of holding the line with unwavering grace. Weeks passed, and then something unexpected happened. Malcolm received an email from the editor of the neighborhood's digital newsletter. They wanted to feature his story, not just the incident, but the way he handled it. They had seen the video like everyone else and now wanted to use it in an upcoming HOA workshop on neighborhood conflict and implicit bias. They also asked to include his footage in their community values section, a first. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was validation. He stared at the message for a moment, then smiled, replying with a simple, "Yes," with one condition: credit the story to patience, not power. Later that day, as Malcolm stood on his porch watering the ferns his mother had sent him from Georgia, another memory surfaced. It was her voice. Warm, southern, and unshakably strong. Let your dignity do the heavy lifting, baby. You don't always have to push. Sometimes you just have to stand. He remembered watching her hold her head high in rooms where people looked down on her. How she corrected people not with her tone, but with her presence. How she taught him that silence, when chosen with purpose, could shake walls louder than yelling ever could. So Malcolm decided to try something different. He printed invitations, not formal, not flashy, just a note on cream cardstock that read, "Come by for a backyard gathering. No speeches, no noise, just neighbors." He dropped them off at every mailbox on the block, even Sandra's. He didn't expect much. A few polite declines, maybe some empty promises. But when Saturday evening came, one by one, they began to arrive. First, an elderly couple from 2 doors down, then a young couple with their daughter, then another. Eventually, almost a dozen families filled the space behind Malcolm's house, folding chairs under string lights, soft music playing, paper plates stacked beside trays of food. Someone brought lemonade. Someone else brought cobbler. And for the first time in 3 years, the space felt like home. Not just for Malcolm, but for the community that had, until now, kept its distance. People mingled. Conversations flowed. There was laughter. Not forced, but genuine. And though Sandra didn't show, Malcolm wasn't waiting for her. This wasn't about her anymore. As dusk settled and neighbors lingered under the soft light of the lanterns, Malcolm stepped away for a moment and looked out toward the street. His driveway stood clear, spotless, and undisturbed. Not because someone had been yelled at. Not because someone had been punished, but because someone had finally been seen. That rectangle of concrete, the one crossed and dismissed so many times before, now stood as more than just parking space. It was a symbol of a man's quiet resolve, of a boundary that mattered, of a victory not won with fists or fury, but with unwavering dignity. And as he looked back at the group, people laughing, clinking glasses, exchanging stories under the stars, Malcolm finally exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but from a deep, hard-earned peace. His driveway remained clear, not because of the noise, but because of the message that silence had delivered. He never raised his voice, but his silence cleared the path. In a world where volume often overshadows value, Malcolm Reeves proved that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't curse, he didn't threaten, he simply stood firm, let truth speak through, patience, and reminded a community, without ever demanding it, that respect is not a favor. It's a right. Have you ever had to fight for something that should have been yours by default? A boundary, a space, a moment of peace that others felt, entitled to disturb? Malcolm's story isn't about a driveway. It's about drawing a line that shouldn't have had to be defended, but was, and doing it without ever losing himself. Dignity doesn't yell. It holds the line, quietly, consistently, powerfully. If Malcolm's story spoke to you, share it. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. It rolls in on 4 wheels. We'll see you next time, where silence isn't weakness. It's power practiced.